Welcome to Chemistry in Action. I'm your host, Arav Chaudhry.
The show where future scientists discover how chemistry becomes real-world technology. Today we're joined by Dr. Tim Holme, the co-founder and chief technology officer of QuantumScape, a leading developer of solid-state lithium metal batteries designed to enable greater energy density, faster charging, and enhanced safety. Tim oversees advanced materials research, technical product development, machine learning, and intellectual property in the company. Tim conducted his PhD in mechanical engineering with Professor Fritz Prinz at Stanford, working on the materials science and electrochemistry of energy conversion and storage devices. He also holds a master's in mechanical engineering and a bachelor's in physics from Stanford. I'm honored to have Tim join us in this initial episode of the podcast. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you're doing this podcast.
In this conversation, we'll explore three major themes: introductory science of batteries, scale-up of technology, and finally, Tim's journey in material science. Let's jump in. Tim, before we dive deep, let's give our younger listeners a foundation on batteries. If you were to explain what's going on inside of a battery to, say, a ninth grader, how would you describe it? What does happen inside a battery?
Battery is storing energy in what's called electrochemical format, which means there's both chemistry and electrons moving around. If you imagine rolling a ball up a hill, that's a way to store energy. If you push a swing up, you've stored gravitational potential energy that can be released by releasing the swing and letting it swing down, converting that potential energy into a kinetic energy. So in a battery, imagine rolling lithium atoms up a hill. You're not literally rolling them up a hill, but you're taking them to a higher place in a chemical energy space. When you charge the battery, you move lithium ions from a state of lower energy to a state of higher energy because they're forming different chemical bonds, actually weaker chemical bonds. So this lithium wants to form stronger chemical bonds. So in that sense, it's got a higher potential energy. That's how a battery is charged, is by essentially metaphorically rolling lithium uphill. And then when the battery is discharged, that lithium is coming back down this metaphorical hill. It's reacting with species it wants to react more strongly with. And that's how it releases its energy in the form of electrons that are going around an external circuit. These electrons have about 4 volts worth of energy. And that's what's giving energy into the car, the phone, whatever is using the battery.
What makes a battery solid state? And why does that matter for safety or performance?
Many batteries include a liquid material. The lead acid starter battery in a car includes a liquid, and the lithium ion battery in your phone or computer uses a liquid electrolyte. This electrolyte is a little bit like Gatorade. It conducts the ions in your body. One part is the useful energy that the battery has stored, and the two parts are released when that liquid burns. So if you replace the liquid with an inflammable material or a material that doesn't burn, then you've made the battery about 2/3 safer. And so this is one of the dreams of a solid state battery. Replace the flammable liquid with a solid that's inflammable, in which case the battery would release less energy, less heat when there's a crash. That is one reason why a solid state battery is interesting. Other reasons include that with some solid state batteries, you can use a lithium metal anode, which is just pure lithium, which is a more dense form of energy storage than what's used in a typical lithium ion battery. So if you make the right kind of a solid state battery, it can be higher energy that offers longer driving range in a car, can also charge faster, and be safer.
Students hear the word separator used in battery work. What is a separator? How is the QuantumScape separator different from legacy approaches in the industry?
Yeah, a separator in a battery is what prevents an internal short circuit. So a short circuit is bad. You would lose all of the energy stored in the battery and potentially also have a safety issue if you create an internal short circuit. So the separator is what keeps the two parts of the battery that store lithium separated so that they don't have an internal short circuit. So those two parts of the battery, one is called an anode, one is called a cathode. Just think of it as the negative and positive side of a battery. And you have to keep a separator in between them that keeps those two sides separate. And then you asked about how QuantumScape is different. In a lithium ion battery, which is the dominant battery used today, the separator is a thin piece of plastic that is porous. So imagine a saran wrap in your kitchen that has a lot of holes poked through it. That's the typical separator. So it provides a barrier with that plastic between the anode and cathode. And the holes are what allow that electrolyte we talked about earlier to pass through it. What we do differently is we replace this plastic material with a fully dense ceramic material. So think of it like a very thin sheet of rock. It's very stable, it's non-flammable, and it still provides the structure to keep the anode and cathode apart in a battery so that there's not a short circuit. Making this material was really difficult. It's what's taken us 10 or 15 years of development and what differentiates us from other competitors in the industry.
Producing high-tech ceramic separators sounds very intriguing given its history as one of the oldest human inventions. Could you explain heat treatment used to make ceramics using an analogy such as baking or caramelizing?
Many people have made pottery before. The process of making pottery is the process of ceramics, and it's very old. If you go into museums, you can see, this Neolithic pot. Humans have been making pottery for tens of thousands of years. First, you form a substance like clay into the right shape, and then you put it into an oven where it cooks. It usually cooks for about a weekend if you're making a pot. Then you take it out, and it's now a fired, dense, hard, brittle ceramic material. So that's the typical process to make a ceramic. If you're baking, you could think about it like baking brownies. First, you have to mix the brownie mix to create the right substance. Then you pour it into a pan to create the right shape. Then you put that into the oven, and it cooks and forms the final substance that you want to eat.
That's a really good explanation. And lastly, what's the simplest way to explain why batteries degrade over time and fail?
It comes down to the anode in a lithium-ion battery. So what's inside the anode are particles of graphite, which is the same as the graphite that's in a pencil, layers of carbon, sheets of carbon. These particles of graphite, think about them as an M&M before the candy shell is applied. It's just the chocolate. And if you put that chocolate in your hand, it melts in your hand. And that's a bad thing. So that's why M&Ms have that candy coating so that it doesn't melt in your hand. In batteries, the analogy here is the graphite needs a candy shell coating to protect it. The graphite would not last long. You need to create a coating on the graphite. And that coating breaks down over time. The graphite actually expands and contracts. Every time you charge a battery, you put lithium into the graphite. And then every time you discharge, the lithium comes back out. And when lithium goes in and out of the graphite expands and contracts, which cracks that shell coating on top of it. Every time it cracks, it has to be reformed. And to reform that candy shell coating consumes some of the other materials inside the battery, like lithium, for example. And so each time you cycle in the battery, charge and discharge it, you consume a little bit of that lithium. And that's the dominant reason why lithium batteries degrade over time.
I see. Now that we've looked at the science of batteries, let's zoom out of it. Let's talk about taking a breakthrough from the lab and the process of scaling it into something that can power a car. When moving from making tiny coin cells to producing large format cells, how does one go about making the transition to scale up and manufacture them? What are the challenges and how have you gone about tackling them?
Yeah, this brings up one of my favorite topics. So the first time that one makes a battery in lab, it's a small device, often like what would power a watch, like a watch battery. It has a capacity in the milliamp watt hours, so small capacity. In the automotive market or the stationary energy storage market, the big markets in batteries, gigafactories run in tens of gigawatt hours of production per year. So there are 13 orders of magnitude. That is 10 trillion times difference in scale between those. So when you're taking a material and a process out of lab into scale, you need to scale up by 10 trillion times. So I'll walk you through how this works. Instead of making one battery, you could work all day and make 10. Okay, now you've got 1 trillion times to go. So you work all year, you can then make 1,000. You now have still 10 billion times to go. So you hire a team of 100 people. So now instead of making 1,000, you make 100,000 in a year. But you still have a factor of 100 million that you need to scale up. So there it's no longer practical to just work longer or hire more people. You need to start doing things in a different way, a more scalable way. You need to invent a process that's no longer everything done boutique, artisanal by hand. This involves some steps that you borrow from other industries and maybe some that you have to invent yourself if you're doing something new. And if you invent a new process, then you need to make the equipment, test the equipment, show that it works, learn enough on the equipment that you can then design the next scale. Because you don't do 100 million all in one step. The factor of 10 is a large step to take. But if you take that step, then you need to take an equally large step, another 8 times. So it can take 1 to 2 years to take this step. That's a factor of 10, and you need to do that 8 times to get to the gigafactory scale. And then, even then, you're not done, because there are now, at this point, about 100 gigafactories running in the world. So this process of scaling is just mind-bogglingly large. Battery factories are some of the biggest buildings in the world, and each one of them could process a trainload of materials a day. Could have a trainload of raw materials coming in and a trainload of finished products coming out every day. One gigafactory can produce over 1 million cells, battery cells per day. So it's just a vast undertaking to make batteries at a commercially relevant scale.
That sounds quite a process, and it's really interesting the way you've been able to tackle it. Lithium-ion batteries have a history of safety concerns. How do you ensure that you're not introducing new safety issues while scaling up your technologies at QuantumScape?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we take safety very seriously. We have a safety test lab where we test our devices. We've thought a lot about it, done calculations, and we think that our solid state material is safer. But really, the proof is in the pudding. So we have to do testing. The key piece of our technology is a ceramic separator that's like a thin rock. So when it gets hot, it doesn't catch on fire. There's good reason to believe that it should be safer than a lithium-ion battery. On the other side, we use a lithium metal anode. And lithium is an extremely reactive material. That's part of why it's good in a battery. You want your battery to store a lot of energy. Because we use a lithium metal anode, we have to do the testing.
I see. And from a sustainability perspective, where do you think solid-state batteries offer the biggest wins?
Yeah, good question. On the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra, the first step is reduce. If you could produce fewer batteries because you just use the ones you have for longer, that would be step one. In terms of reuse, there are potential that we could reuse parts of our battery. The separator that I mentioned, for instance, does not degrade when we use it in place in the battery. So it could potentially be reused. And then recycling is the third component. We are already working with recycling partners to recycle the batteries that we make for testing, the scrap that comes out of our lab. I think that the enabling the circular economy is something that it's not unique to QuantumScape. A lot of battery companies are talking about recycling, and battery recycling companies are being formed because we do want to close the loop. And the thought process there is, if you're digging a material out of the ground, it often comes in the parts per million, or 10, maybe 100 parts per million quantity. But if you're recycling a battery, it's already concentrated right there into percent levels. It's maybe 100 times more concentrated in the battery than it is digging out of the ground. So if it can be economical to dig materials out of the ground and purify them to the point where they can be used in batteries, then sure ought to be economical to use the already enriched or refined products in an existing battery to reformat them and create the feedstock for the next battery.
That's a very enlightening perspective to share, and I think it's really interesting how you guys are working to do that. Now that we've explored the science, as well as the engineering and scaling of battery technology, we should shift to something equally as important, the people behind the work. Let's talk about your journey, Tim. Was there ever a moment in your childhood or school years that first sparked your interest in chemical engineering or material science?
Well, I pretty clearly remember what got me interested in energy. There were two turning points to that story. The first one is I was attending a lecture that was on the top global problems in the world. And they were looking at things like hunger, poverty, war. And what they pointed out is that a lot of the top 10 problems in the world have energy at the root. For example, access to clean drinking water is a big problem for many in the world. If we had a source of clean, abundant, cheap energy, then it would be pretty straightforward to desalinate seawater and get clean drinking water for people. So that's just one example of how cheap and abundant energy could solve a lot of the problems. So that really turned me on to energy. And then a second turning point was I was on a road trip driving through southwestern US, and I saw these giant deserts that had a lot of sun and very little else. And I thought, boy, we could really turn this into a very productive place by putting a lot of solar panels out here. And that by doing so, we could provide clean, renewable energy and address some problems. And then from there, I got into batteries because I could already see that solar was a technology that was going to be scaled up. That vision has come true now, but the problem is that the sun isn't always shining. So do need to do something to
Yeah.
store that energy. And so that's what got me interested in energy storage and batteries.
Have you ever had an experiment in your journey or a prototype that absolutely didn't work? And did you learn anything from doing so?
In science and research, the default assumption is that experiments aren't going to work, because that's what happens most of the time, honestly. And I think what separates better researchers or better science programs from worse ones is how you react to those failures. How do you use your intuition, your judgment, the data that you generate to turn those failures into successes more frequently? Sometimes that means abandoning a line of work and turning to something more fruitful. Sometimes it's just problem solving, persistence, figuring out what is going to work. I couldn't maybe point at any one experience, but that's just the day in, day out work of being a scientist, is failing and learning how to adapt.
And on the subject of day in, day out work, what does a typical day look like for you across lab work, data analysis, collaboration, and problem solving?
At this point, unfortunately, most of my day is in meetings. I'm discussing with people company strategy, technical strategy, culture, budgets, what have you. But for junior scientists in the company, what their day looks like is a lot of time spent in our labs, running equipment and getting hands-on feel of what's happening in the labs, what our process is producing, and then doing a lot of data analysis to understand what are the implications of the experiments, planning, preparing some presentations to share the results with their colleagues, and then planning what the next steps are.
And for other students potentially interested in entering this field, what chemistry, physics, or engineering skills, and what other potential tools like coding or data analysis, for example, would be most valuable?
Everything you mentioned are valuable skills. A good analogy I've heard is to be a T-shaped person. So an I-shaped person is deep in one area. The opposite of that is somebody who's broad, kind of shallow in many areas. And a T-shaped person has exposure to many different areas and one or two areas of depth. I think this T shape is a good way to think about shaping your career. Have one area that you're really expert in, and then have other areas where you can apply that expertise that you have got passing familiarity. And if you can manage to get two areas of expertise, then it can be really fertile to kind of cross-pollinate those two areas and see how insights or techniques from one field interact with a second field. Any of the fields that you mentioned are good. One thing you mentioned, data analysis or computer programming, AI. This is a rapidly growing field. So fields that are new and rapidly growing are the ones that are going to produce the most opportunities. So if I had to pick one thing, maybe I'd suggest that.
Given the proliferation of AI and machine learning, advances in computer science often appear to move faster and receive significantly more attention than research rooted in physical sciences, for example. What advice and motivation would you offer to high school students who are interested in pursuing a career path like yours?
Yeah. So I think there are some good reasons why it appears that CS moves quickly. One of them is that you can use a debugger in CS and figure out where the problems are. And if you're running a reactor, like a chemical reactor or something that happens in an oven, you can't step through the positions of every atom and say, oh, that's where it went wrong, and then let me rewrite the code to make the atom move over here instead. So it's a more kind of brute force trial and error method where you apply all the techniques that you can to study the positions of the atoms, but you just don't get as fine resolution as in computer science, for example. So it does require more persistence, more experimentation, but to inspire that line of work, I think it offers tremendous opportunity. Still, a lot of the world operates on atoms. People who drive to work in a car need the source of energy. They need a car to drive to work in. Future technologies like drones and robots are going to have AI behind them, but they are also physical instantiations of a product that requires engineers to understand, how do you make good sensors in a robot, for example? That's an unsolved problem. So I think whether you're doing computer science or working in other engineering fields, there are exciting problems to be solved.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your stories, and your passion for advancing material science, Tim. And to our listeners, keep exploring, experimenting, and asking questions. This is Chemistry in Action, where science meets the real world. I'll see you next time.